All right. So in 3, 2.
Good afternoon. As Vice Chair, I now call to order the May 8th, 2023 meeting of the Policy Review Committee of the Board of Education of Baltimore County. In accordance with Board Policy 8311, the Chair of the committee, at their discretion and after consultation with the staff liaison, may convene an in-person committee meeting. Otherwise, all committee meetings will be held electronically. Today's Policy Review Committee meeting is being held virtually and broadcasted through Microsoft Teams live on the BCPS website. To conduct this meeting by virtual means, all voting items this afternoon will be done by a roll call vote. Board members will say their names before making and seconding a motion as applicable, as well as when requesting discussion on an agenda item. Additionally, as a courtesy to the committee, I ask that you inform Ms. Wash, Ms. Pitts, or Ms. Howie if you must leave the call by using the Teams chat feature so that a quorum can be maintained. Ms. Pitts, please call the roll to determine the presence of a quorum of the committee.
Yes, thank you. Ms. Frimpong?
Present.
Thank you. Ms. Harvey?
Present.
Thank you. Ms. Hassan?
Present.
Thank you. And Dr. Savoy?
Present. Oh, finally, I'm sorry, present.
Thank you. That's all right. And Ms. Pumphrey?
Present.
Thank you. We have a quorum.
Chair Pumphrey, would you like me to continue with the introductions or?
Sure, please. Yes,
Okay.
yes, please.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Pitts. Will you please now call the roll to determine which staff members are present in this meeting?
Absolutely. Dr. Boswell McComas?
Present. Present.
Thank you. Dr. Holmes?
Present.
Thank you. Ms. Shea?
Present.
Thanks. Ms. Barr?
Present.
Thank you. Ms. Howie?
Here.
Thank you. And Ms. Wash?
Here.
Thank you. Attendance is completed. I'll pass the meeting back over, Vice Chair.
Thank you. I will hand the meeting over to Madam Chair Pumphrey.
Thank you very much. First on our agenda is item B1, policy 6002, selection of instructional materials. And for this item, we call on Ms. Shea.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Pumphrey, Vice Chair, excuse me, Vice Chair Harvey, and members of the committee. I am here today to bring back the policy 6002 with some updated revisions based on direction at the last committee meeting in November. Since we've had some change in staff, I will briefly describe this policy. 6002 is necessary for the work of our system because this is the policy that we use for the selection of materials for instruction. The committee met to revise this policy and specifically made the following changes based both on relevant public works recommendations as well as work across the system. So specifically, we fleshed out a definition of instructional materials to reflect that many of the materials of instruction that we purpose are print and digital, and to make sure that we expanded that definition to include a wide range of materials for instruction, given that we continue to expand our offerings of courses outside of some of the content areas that we're used to procuring materials for. So in terms of things like career and technical education. We also were intentional about including language regarding educational equity, and to make sure that equitable access as identified in policy 0100 is also explicit in the selection of our instructional materials. We also included language regarding data privacy and web content accessibility guidelines. I'll pause here because this is the area that actually we received feedback when we came in November of 22 to the Policy Review Committee. We were given feedback at the time to strengthen that language. So what we have done here is actually reflect that language around separating both the need to ensure data privacy based on board governance, while also ensuring that we are keeping any digital content accessible based on web content accessibility guidelines. That's critically important because the instructional materials that we purchase, even when we purchase print materials, they very often include a digital component. And then last, we also included language talking about the importance of evaluating the effectiveness of instructional materials at the time of any renewal or repurchase. And so I'm here today to bring back I wanted to give a general overview of the changes we brought forward in November, but then specifically to bring back the language that we strengthened regarding student data privacy and access. And so with that, I'm here for any questions or comments that board members may have for me.
Thank you, Ms. Shea.
Sure.
Is there any discussion or questions regarding policy 6002? Vice Chair Harvey?
Thank you. Just quickly, the policy, having not participated in the November session, the policy states that it applies to materials, instructional materials for system-wide use. So are there occasions when there's material that may be school or program specific, particularly with our special needs, educational programs or our media centers or things like that? Are those included in this policy?
So that is an excellent question, and you are correct. This policy is actually specifically just for those materials that are purchased for system-wide use. Now, to sort of split what you shared, this policy would not apply if an individual principal were, so for example, some school communities do something with their PTA like one school, one book. And so those types of purchases are not for system-wide use and would not fall within this policy. However, the other piece of your question, if we are purchasing something for a specific population that may not be all 112,000 plus students, but might, for example, be for our multilingual learners or for special education, if the material is for system-wide use to serve that population, then it would fall under this policy specifically.
Thank you.
Sure.
Any other questions or discussion? Okay, if there are no corrections, policy 6002 is moved forward to first reader as presented. Thank you, Ms. Shea.
Thank you.
Members of the committee, may Ms. Shea be excused? I believe that's the only policy she had on today.
I'm actually
Yes.
here for one.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
I
never
think I need to
mind.
stay, but I appreciate you.
Okay, next on the agenda is item B2, which is policy 8315, meetings, participation by the public.
Members of the committee, I would ask that this item be deferred until the end of the meeting, as I'm the only presenter. Staff does not need, other staff members, particularly CNI and Audit, do not have to be in the meeting for this discussion.
Thank you. Is there any objection to moving the discussion of policy 8315 to the end of the agenda?
This is Harvey, no objection.
Frimpong, no objection.
Okay. I'm hearing none. The agenda will be adjusted accordingly. And that brings us to item C1, policy 5000, students. And for that, we again call on Ms. Shea.
I'm back. Good afternoon. So good afternoon, members of the committee. I am here bringing forward a recommendation that policy 5000, currently labeled as students, be marked for deletion. The rationale for recommending this policy for deletion is that this policy outlines expectations around students that are covered explicitly in other policies throughout the system. So in the policy analysis documents, we talk specifically and give reference within each section of this policy of the redundancy and how that same expectation and belief regarding students is covered in another policy that the board has. In addition, we researched other local education agencies in surrounding counties and identified that other school systems did not have a standalone policy, but did exactly what we're recommending, which is that each of the policy standards regarding students is embedded in another explicit policy regarding students. So some examples of that are policies regarding grading and reporting, policies regarding our basic board commitments, and certainly our educational equity policy. So with that, our committee's recommendation is that this policy be marked for deletion, and I'm here for any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Shea.
Sure.
Are there any questions or is there any discussion on recommended changes to policy 5000? If there are no suggestions to staff, then the policy will remain unchanged. The committee's report will reflect policy 5000 is moved forward for first reader as presented. Or is this for deletion? Sorry, I apologize.
Thank you. And Ms. Howie, I think I'm going to hang on to support Dr. Holmes and Dr. McComas with student engagement.
Thank you, Ms. Shea. Next on our agenda is item C2, policy 5330, student engagement, and this is a new policy. And for this, we call on Dr. Boswell McComas.
Yeah, so good afternoon, everyone. A year ago, our SMOB, Christian Thomas, put forward the request that we develop policy specifically to engage students. And I'd like to take a moment to thank not just my team, but Ms. Howie for her support in developing this policy from scratch. What we did was really look at what other school systems had in terms of their policies related to student engagement. And we began by really codifying what exactly we already do in terms of our practice with our student member of the board. And so if you look through the policy itself, what you will find is we acknowledge all the things that are in fact our current practice of how our student member of the board participates in board meetings, and is a reliable voice by which student perspective and student insight is provided to our board, along with our students who speak at board meetings and student participation in the area advisory councils. So I'll just leave it at that if there's any additional questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions or discussion regarding policy 5330, student engagement? Okay, if there are no corrections and no objection, policy 5330 is moved forward to first reader as presented.
I'm sorry.
Yes, ma'am.
I just had a clarification. The policy, okay, I see it. I was reading about when they would be able to have access to the public presentation at the board, but it says that they will have the opportunity to present at each scheduled business meeting. So that answers my question. Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, if there are no corrections and no objection, policy 5330 is moved forward for first reader as presented.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. McComas.
My pleasure.
And I do believe, members of the committee, that CNI's policies are completed. So now, if Ms. Shea, Dr. McComas, and Dr. Holmes may be excused.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, colleagues.
Okay, next on our agenda is item C3, policy 8400, Office of Internal Audit. And for this item, we call on Ms. Barr.
Good afternoon. Policy 8400 is brought to you this afternoon based on the regular 7-year policy review and revision schedule. The Office of Internal Audit is requesting that Policy 8400 be revised to be aligned with the proposed new Policy 8430 Audit Committee. Additionally, the changes need to be made to be more reflective and aligned with the industry standards that the Office of Internal Audit currently follows in the execution of its role and responsibilities for the school system. We currently follow internal audit industry standards that are identified in the Institute of Internal Auditors International Professional Practices Framework, referred to as IPPF, or the Red Book, and the book is actually red. The Red Book is the conceptual framework that organizes the authoritative guidance promulgated by the Institute of Internal Auditors, or the IIA. The IIA provides internal audit professionals worldwide with authoritative guidance. The mandatory elements of the Red Book are 4 principles for the professional practice of internal auditing, the Code of Ethics, the IPPF standards, and the definition of internal auditing. Guide adherence with the mandatory elements of the IPPF provides a framework for performing and promoting a broad range of value-added auditing services. Following these standards also establishes the basis for the evaluation of internal audit performance and fosters improved organizational processes and operation. The suggested policy changes have come from the charter adopted by the Audit Committee on January 13, 2021, and approved by the Board on April 20, 2021. An internal audit charter documents the role, standards, authority, and responsibility of the Office of Internal Audit. However, since the school system documents these requirements in board policy and superintendent rules, we have modified the charter to allow it to meet the board's policy requirements and conventions. These modifications were approved unanimously by the Audit Committee on March 21, 2023, to be moved to this committee at this evening's meeting. Additionally, several of our colleagues in the state, such as Baltimore City, Harford County, and Prince George's County, have incorporated their internal audit charters into their policies. I thank you for your consideration to these updates to Policy 8400. They will allow us to establish the authority of the office, how the office is supposed to implement its role and responsibilities in the school system, while allowing consistency with the IIA Red Book standards. I can now respond to any questions the committee may have.
Thank you, Ms. Barr. Are there any questions or any discussion regarding this policy? Okay, if there are no corrections and no objection, Policy 8400 is moved forward for first reader as presented. Thank you. Oh, I think you have another one, Ms. Barr.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Policy
Yes.
84.
Thank you. Sorry.
Should I just keep going now?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Policy 8410 is brought to you this afternoon due to the regular 7-year policy review and revision schedule. The Office of Internal Audit is recommending this policy for readoption as we have no substantive recommended revisions to the policy, only those required to conform with the policy review handbook guidance recommending the use of gender inclusive language and to conform with the policy review committee's editing convention.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you. Are there any questions or discussion regarding Policy 8410? Okay, if there are no corrections and no objection, Policy 8410 is moved forward to first reader as presented. Next on our agenda is Policy 8420, Anti-Retaliation, and for that we also follow Ms. Barr.
Yes, Policy 8420 is brought to you this afternoon due to the regular 7-year policy review and revision schedule. Like Policy 8410, we are recommending this policy for readoption as we have no substantive recommended revisions to this policy, only those required to conform with the policy review handbook guidance recommending the use of gender inclusive language and to conform with the Policy Review Committee's editing convention.
Thank you, Ms. Barr. Are there any questions or discussion regarding policy 8420? If there are no corrections and no objection, policy 8420 is moved forward for first reader as presented. Next on our agenda is policy 8430, audit committee charter, and this is a new policy. And again, we call on Ms. Barr.
Thank you. The Office of Internal Audit is requesting that policy 8430 be established to align with board policy 8400 and to be more reflective of industry standards promulgated by the Institute of Internal Auditors, also referred to as the IIA. The suggested policy addition comes from the charter adopted by the Audit Committee on January 13, 2021, and approved by the board on April 20, 2021. An audit committee charter documents the role, standards, authority, and responsibility of an audit committee. However, since the school system documents these requirements in board policy and superintendent rules, we have modified the charter to allow it to meet the board's policy requirements and conventions. These modifications were also approved unanimously by the audit committee on March 21, 2023, to be moved to this committee at this evening's meeting. Additionally, several of our colleagues in the state, such as Harford County and Howard County, as well as King Park Central School District and Kings Park, New York, have incorporated their audit committee charters into their policy. We thank you for your consideration for the addition of policy 8430. This will allow the board to establish the authority of the committee, how the committee is supposed to implement its role and responsibilities in the school system while allowing consistency with the IIA standards.
Thank you, Ms. Barr.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any questions or discussion regarding policy 8430?
I have a question. This is Frimpong.
Sure, Ms.
I guess
Frimpong.
just for clarification, so this is a policy that's brand new, but the audit committee has already been in existence, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so I guess my question I was trying to understand is then, so we had a committee without a policy. We don't have to have the policy first before we establish the committee?
It's taken this long to get the policy established.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
So I guess that brings me to another question. The current audit committee, did they have any changes to this policy? This was brought forth by the prior committee, correct? The initial.
It was adopted on January 13, 2021, and then approved by the previous board on April 20th, 2021. However, this current, well, not the current audit committee because there are two new members, but on March 21st, 2023, which was just recently, they looked at the charter and they unanimously approved to bring it to the PRC this evening as it was written and presented to them. So they offered no changes to the information that we presented to them on March 21, 2023.
And
So now when we have our next committee in May, we'll have two new members, Mr. Young and Ms. Frimpong, on the committee,
so
as well as Mr. McMillian, who's the audit committee chair, and Ms. Lichter, who is the vice chair. And I believe Ms. Hassan was on the committee as well.
point of clarification, I just want to make sure it's clear. I believe that Ms. Barr stated it in her explanation of both this policy as well as the audit charter. This is form versus content. So the content of the charter already exists. It's that the charter is now embodied in policy. So as to Ms. Frimpong's question about whether or not there had been a policy before, there was not, but there was a charter. but the charter was not embodied in any system-wide document, even though it had been approved by the board almost 2 years ago, or more than 2 years ago, because it would have been in January of 21. So it's a matter of just putting the content in a different format.
Thank you. Are there any additional questions? Okay, if there are no corrections and no objection, policy 8430 is moved forward for first reader as presented. Thank you, Ms. Barr.
Thank you.
May Ms. Barr be excused, members of the committee?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Barr.
Thank you.
Next on our agenda is item B2, which was moved to the end of the agenda at the beginning of the meeting. It's policy 8315, meetings, participation by the public. And for this, we call Ms. Howie.
Thank you, members of the committee. So you have before you a revised analysis that explains the history of 8315, but I'll still make sure that I go through some of the key points for members who were not here previously. So first of all, policy 8135 is your policy about public participation. How is it that you want the public to participate in your regular school board meetings? This policy was committed to PRC actually in March of 2021. However, because of a piece of litigation that is referenced in the policy analysis, staff waited until the litigation was exhausted before bringing the policy back to the committee. In February and in March, this committee discussed possible changes, some suggestions that were made by staff, but then in March, the committee clarified what you wanted to see in a new policy. So specifically, what was asked at your March meeting and what you see in option 1 is having 4 categories of groups, if you will, that are able to address the board. And in option 1, those 4 categories of groups are as follows. First, groups that are assigned with a liaison. Second, nonprofit community groups. Third, individuals. And fourth, bargaining groups. And each of those is defined in option 1. However, staff also wanted to give you another option simply to make your life more interesting. So in option 2, what you have instead of 4 groups are 2 groups with 5 slots each, and then basically open for the other 10 slots. So we think that this will democratize, and this was one of the concerns that the committee expressed in its last meeting, and broaden the number of individuals and specifically voices that address the board. And in order to clarify that you wanted as many people as possible to participate, what we've included in both iterations of the policy is that if individuals have spoken in the last 30 days, then their space, if there are not sufficient spaces, will be ceded to individuals who have not spoken to you in the last 30 days. And I did confer with Ms. Gover prior to putting this pen to paper, and she did indicate that it was possible to do a search to ensure that, again, you're hearing from as many individuals as possible from as broad a number of people as possible. And just to refer you as well to the analysis, specifically related to option 2, in Calvert County, your sister jurisdiction does not name groups, but gives, for example, 3 minutes to individuals and 5 minutes to groups if an individual says he or she is representing a group. Frederick County just that the individual indicates whether or not he or she is representing a group or an organization. Harford County, like Culver County, 3 minutes if a person is speaking as an individual, 5 minutes if an individual is speaking on behalf of a group. So, and you'll see in the analysis that there are some school systems, for example, Baltimore City, that specifically names groups that have what they call reserved spaces. Montgomery County as well names a number of groups. So we thought that this gave the committee something to work with as to how you want to have the public participate in your meetings. So with that, it's now yours.
Thank you, Ms. Howie. And we will open this for discussion, which I'm sure there is plenty. Anybody like to start and share what you think about the two options?
This is, oh, go ahead, Robin.
No, ma'am. After you.
Is this okay or what? So I'm trying to understand, make sure I have clarification on between the first and the second. So
Sure.
with the second group, I'm sorry, the second option, it would be just 10 spots total after the two groups. And
Correct.
then with the first one, it's a total of 4 groups, and that does not include the 10 spots just open to individuals.
So with the with both options have 20 spaces.
20, okay.
Because there are 5 units, for example. You have 5 spaces for community groups, 5 spaces for school system affiliated groups, and then 5 spaces for everybody else in the world. So that would be your, for individuals rather. So that would be option 1, that you allocate those 20 spaces between the 4 groups. In option 2, we have, or what staff is recommending, is that you take out the community groups, the nonprofit community groups, and have 5 spaces for unions, 5 spaces for school system affiliated groups, and then 10 spaces for groups or individuals who wish to address you. So either way, you'd still have 20 spaces.
Okay. So I'll just pose it's not completely hypothetical, but for example, I know with this policy, the last time it was, it speaks to stakeholder groups as of like 2018, 2019 that were established. So for example, with the equity group, there's an advisory associated there. So they're now an advisory, but because they were not established by 2018, 2019, they don't have that guaranteed stakeholder spot. So
well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
So would both of those options capture their ability to speak, or would one or the other? Again, so just the idea of we have a new advisory and being able to be as a stakeholder, be able to speak to the board, which option would capture that?
Okay, so the definition of stakeholder group is, our recommendation in both options is that be eliminated. So there is no longer the category of stakeholder. You do have the category of school system affiliated group, and that would be the advisory committee or councils to the board to which the superintendent has assigned a staff liaison. So, and that includes your area advisories as well as the student council. So at present, the Career and Tech Council, Gifted and Talented Education Council, or the Council for Gifted and Talented Education, PTA, Special Ed Citizens Advisory, Student Councils, and the Area Education Advisory Councils would be the school system affiliated. As far as groups such as the Equity Council, they would be able to speak with other groups. So the NAACP, for example, which would be a community group or someone who is coming to speak on behalf of the NAACP, they would be able to speak in that group, if you will.
Okay, so then what we're removing stakeholder group and we're putting them under school advisories, but then, and again, it sounds like it's still for the ones that are established as of 2018, 2019, because the equity is still with BCPS, but yet they get moved to a community group in that category.
Well, they did, as you said correctly, they did not exist as of 1819, and the current stakeholder groups, which are in the chat but also on the website, include the Student Council, TABCO, CASE, ESPBC, OPE, and AFSCME, the Area Advisory Council Coordinator, BCAPSI, the Career and Technology Educational Advisory Council, the Gifted and Talented Education Citizens Advisory Council, the NAACP, the Randallstown chapter of the NAACP, the PTA Council, Special Education Citizens Advisory Committee, and then one BCPS student.
Okay. Okay.
So again, this is, and we talked about this just today, how does the board want to recognize its members of the public? Our concern was, and I think we've expressed this before, or staff has expressed this before, that the designation of stakeholders carries with it a certain imprimatur, and the downside is that individuals, when they are not in the stakeholder category, believe that the board is not going to listen to them in the same way. So then the concern becomes, how do I become a stakeholder? Which is the litigation which is what caused the litigation in the first place. And you can't avoid litigation. That's why I have a job. But you do want to make sure that people feel they're being treated fairly. And there are 24 different or 23 other examples as to how other school systems in the state do this. So we wanted to make sure that the board had enough exemplars and that you have enough to be able to make the determination about, how do we want the public to be heard? And if the board wants to keep stakeholders and simply add to the list, that is certainly the board's prerogative. It's simply not staff's recommendation, but if that's what the board wants, that's what the board wants.
Okay,
So-
I'm gonna wait, and I
Okay.
have more comments, but I'll go ahead and
Sure, I
wait.
was just gonna say, I know the feeling. It's difficult when you sort of come into the middle of a policy review, and we started reviewing this at the beginning of, when the first elected board members after we were sworn in. So a big part of the discussion was, and for me, it was important that to point out that the definition of stakeholder group under this policy was being used in so many other areas. Whereas the policy itself is the intent, in my opinion, is for regarding participation by the public at our Board of Ed meetings. However, it was the definition, quote unquote, for stakeholders was being pulled from this policy to be used to define who, for many different things, like, for example, who the groups that the superintendent may choose for certain projects or for certain input, I guess is the right word. So I think by pulling that definition out, then it pulls that away from this policy, and we're no longer using this policy for that definition itself.
So, this is Mrs. Harvey. I think I hear where Ms. Frimpong is expressing with this particular group, serving on the equity committee as well. The advisory council works directly to advise the committee and the system regarding issues of equity. And so I wonder how we're defining advisory, if the advisory group, if they don't meet the current definition.
And they were not what was anticipated when the definition was written. That doesn't mean that they can't be one, they can't have one of the 5 slots, either if they're named directly, because, for example, the student council and the education advisory councils are, if they're considered an education advisory council, this is your policy. You can define them as such, and that's the direction you can provide so that they're able to sign up in one of those slots.
And that would pertain to both of these options, correct, Ms. Howie?
Yes, they would be considered a school system affiliated group. Again, if that is, I think I'm tracking with what Ms. Frempong and Ms. Harvey are saying, that this is a group that advises the equity committee, and as such, it is, committee or council to the board. That's the way, again, I wasn't thinking about them when the definition was crafted, but if you want to either expand it or define it in this context as that's who you anticipated.
Well, I think they certainly could be added to the list. They meet the advisory criterion. They have a school system staff person assigned to them, so they meet the criterion as established in both policies. And given, go ahead.
And I'm not sure, but I will confirm that the superintendent has actually assigned a staff liaison to the council. The reason that I named the ones I did is because the superintendent specifically says to a particular individual, usually at cabinet level, that they're the liaison. And that's one of the reasons I didn't anticipate equity council, because that wasn't the information that came back to me. But again, this can be as you define it. And if you're expanding on the definition, then this is the board's policy.
So just to clarify, Ms. Howie, are you saying that we would have to change the wording of the policy, or that they're already included based on the wording that's already present in both options?
So as I drafted, I was not informed, and perhaps it's because this is something of which I'm not aware, but I was not informed that the Equity Council had a superintendent assigned staff member. So I can do one of two things. I can confirm that, because if what I'm hearing from the committee is that it's your desire that the Equity Council be included in this definition. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, that would be correct.
Okay, so I can confirm that whether or not the superintendent has assigned anyone, but another possibility is simply to take out the language to which the superintendent has assigned a staff liaison. So it would read, any advisory committee or council to the board, including the area education advisory councils and the student council.
Ms. Howie, can you, I'm just looking for that paragraph. Which paragraph?
Oh, sure. It's I'm looking at option 2 actually, but it is 2A.
Okay, thank you.
Surely. So that would be at line 15. But let me find option 1 as well. And in option 1, it's the same line.
Okay. So if we were to pull the language regarding the superintendent has assigned a staff liaison. Sorry, I'm just reading this carefully. School system affiliated group.
I'm comfortable with that.
You do or you don't?
I am, because for me, the key language is any advisory committee or council to the board. So if they're advising us, then if we put a group together to advise the board, or whether it's the board doing it or the superintendent doing it or some combination thereof, we've asked them to advise us, they should be able to speak at the meetings.
Okay. So I think what I'm hearing is that would allow sort of a fluidity to the policy so that that definition isn't, it can change depending upon who the board decides a group the board may decide they need to be, advice. Or we may form a group for any particular reason for which we take advice, and at that point they would fit under that definition.
The other thing that the board can consider is at your retreats, determine whether or not there are any new groups that fit into this definition. So because perhaps there's a group that hasn't shown up or a group that no longer exists for whatever reason. So that would allow you to continue, and to use Ms. Pumphrey's words, have some fluidity here, and you would be able to evaluate it more regularly than the 218, 219. And again, if something has happened over that school year and you have created a particular group, you're able to articulate and communicate back to staff that this is who you expect to see in this category.
I'm good with that. From speaking.
Okay. So between option 1 and option 2, what are we thinking is preferred based on the additional language in, is additional language or remove language in option 2?
Language.
The additional information in policy is in option 2. Is it option 2? Sorry, now I'm confusing the two.
Okay, so option 2 takes out nonprofit community groups. So you have 10 slots, 5 for school system affiliated groups, 5 for your unions, and then 10 is for anyone else in the world who wants to show up, whether or not they're an individual or a group. So with option 1, you have 4 categories and 5 slots each. And those, the third category would be the nonprofit community group, and the fourth category would be individuals.
So in option 2, we're sort of bulking the community groups with individuals, and in option 1, we're separating them.
Correct.
Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. And option 1 was your preference. That is at least the way staff interpreted the request at the last meeting, that you wanted nonprofit community groups. We just kind of fashioned a definition based on some of the discussion. But again, when looking at other LEAs and looking at what other LEAs do, which is most of them do not identify groups. Most of them simply let individuals speak, and they can say, I'm speaking on behalf of this group, as opposed to forcing someone into the group. And I don't mean that negatively, committee members, placing them in that category.
I think, and I'm trying to think back to all of our prior discussions, I think part of our thought process as a committee, as far as separating the community group item from individuals, was to allow groups without defining specific groups to have separate slots compared to individuals.
Right. The thought was for them to have dedicated, if we were going to remove the definition, but really, when you look at the list, all we've done is take out the NAACPs. I mean, all the other groups on the old stakeholder list are redefined in either the advisory or the union category, pretty much. So the thinking was to make sure that community groups had dedicated space where they could speak at the meetings rather than be put in the same pool as the general public and take up those slots.
All that without keeping that definition of stakeholders in there, which removes the aspect of litigation and groups trying to become stakeholders based upon thinking that we would, give them more, listen to them more because they're defined as stakeholders. Does that sound correct?
Yes, I mean, it really was to give organizations a dedicated voice at the meetings rather than just the unions and the advisories, having community groups have dedicated space as community groups to speak at every meeting.
I like your explanation way better than mine, Ms. Harvey. Thank you.
Again, we wanted to make sure we were responsive to what the committee asked for, but also, it's think of it as a buffet.
So I read the analysis, and there were some jurisdictions that had no defined groups. They just had 20 slots or
Right.
10 slots, and you could speak for 5 minutes or however long, and whoever signed up, signed up.
Right. So again, you have the world at your feet as far as making the decisions. I don't know if that is something that your public is going to be amenable to. You did
Oh, wow.
so, I mean, you did get quite a lot of responses.
Yes.
About the perception that eliminating the stakeholders and eliminating that status was somehow going to diminish your ability to listen to your public, which is part of the same issue with respect to designating groups as stakeholders. So if the perception is that you're taking away everything from everyone, I'm just not sure that would be successful.
Oh no, I was just commenting on that. I did see that there. I do have an operational question. I'm not sure if this impacts the policy or not, but when we talked about the community groups, we talked about not having being nonprofits, which
Sure.
is, having the 501c3 status, or I forget what the other nonprofit status is. And that brings to the operational question of how that vetting process would go.
Verifying.
So I don't know that you want Ms. Gover to require that individuals, when they sign up, also make sure they send their IRS letter indicating that they've received 501c3 status. I'm not sure you want that granular a review. It's up to you. I mean, in the same way that we say, or that other LEAs say, if you're representing a group, just tell us. If they're representing a group, tell us.
I think that I think requiring that paperwork would be a challenge. However, I think we would have the option, if we repeatedly hear from a group that we think may be an issue and we imagine is not a nonprofit, we could ask them to provide that information because they speak on a normal basis, and we want to verify that they are indeed a nonprofit.
Okay.
That's a thought.
No, I had the opposite thought. This is from Pong. Well, it may be tedious, because there is I hate stat, because it falls under community group, if it is supposed to be nonprofit, just for that first time to vet an organization, and then they wouldn't have to repeat it. And then in the meantime, right, so it's kind of switching with what you're saying, and then they could still speak under the individual once it's vetted, like we're good to go, that, there can be a list or a spreadsheet, and they don't have to do that again.
I like that idea.
But I do think, again, you want to kind of prevent abuse. I guess for me, as far as my perspective on this, I am for option one. I think there's something to be said for having certain structure where we know, where we have slots that we can expect to hear from certain groups. It is their choice whether or not to use it, but we can expect to hear from certain groups, because again, I think of it as that whole advisory role, or even on a scale of community, because then it's not just a single person. When I think of community groups, I'm thinking that they're representing more than just themselves.
Right.
Compared to an individual who comes in. And the other piece of that sometimes is that we have individuals come in, and at, like, for example, the most recent board meeting, about 4 or 5 of the individuals are also speaking on the same topic. And so a lot of times those 10 spots happen, they get filled up when there's like a hot topic kind of thing. So we want to make sure that we're still able to give the public an opportunity to capture that. But this may go against, this may not be popular opinion, but I don't know that we need to hear 5 different individual opinions on the same topic expressing the same view for the point to get across that I guess it's an issue.
So, I'm sorry, go ahead, Ms. Ari.
So I also think if we don't have a vetting process, like I can go before the board and say, I represent the community group, ABC parents.
Right.
And that gives a different impression to the public, as opposed to me saying, I'm Robin and I'm here to talk about this. And so, an organization that seeks to and completes the process of obtaining nonprofit status has to have certain things in place in terms of their mission, their values, their operations, their finance. All of those things have to be in place. And I think if we're going to commit time specifically to them, then we should know that they have completed that standard. Otherwise, I think we should just have 10. We should just have 10 regular spots if we're not going to vet, because I think it could potentially be misleading to the public if we're not saying, if you're speaking during this section, you are a recognized nonprofit and have 501c3 status.
I agree. I think I was more concerned about Ms. Gover having to establish that every time. But as Ms. Frempong pointed out, once that's done the first time, we have a list that we know they are a nonprofit. And so she wouldn't have to go through that process at each meeting whenever a group wanted to speak. So yes, I agree with both of you on that.
I agree with you all too, but another thing is that a different group could come up and then have the same ideas or whatever, like a parent group, and they could say that they're representing such and such, and you still have to vet them as well. Correct?
If they're coming forward.
Yes,
Dr. Savoy.
Sorry, Dr. Savoy. I think it's going to be difficult to, or Ms. Howard, were you about to speak to that?
No,
I apologize.
Go ahead.
I think it may be difficult to stop individuals or groups from speaking on the same topic, especially when it's a hot topic. So a lot of individuals are attending the meetings just for that purpose.
Right.
I think as a committee, when we discussed this previously, part of adding letter C under paragraph 3 under public comment about the 30 calendar days,
Mhm.
was to allow more individuals to speak who maybe don't show up at every meeting. So we're not hearing from the same people over and over again. But I believe by adding first priority, which I don't think is something we mentioned in this discussion, if all the slots aren't filled, people who have spoken previously can do still have the option to speak that at consecutive meetings. This just allows, if a meeting is, if we don't have any more spots for individuals and someone hasn't spoken at a meeting, they will have the opportunity because they haven't spoken in the last 30 days, which I think is important because
Okay.
we have had circumstances where individuals have signed up to speak and we looked at the list and we didn't get to hear from them at the meeting, and we've never heard from them in the past, unfortunately.
Right.
Where the 10 speakers that we did hear from, all 10 of them we've heard from in the past. And I just think, as a committee and as a board, we're trying as best we can to hear and listen to the public as much as possible. We want to hear what everybody has to say. So we want to, with this policy, want to provide that opportunity to be sure we're hearing from as many people and groups as possible.
Okay. Thank you.
So with that, responding to something Ms. Frempong said, that if multiple individuals show up to speak on the same topic, some of your sister jurisdictions, St. Mary's, I think, is one, and might be Allegheny is one of the western counties, indicated that if there are if there are people who speak on the same topic, then the chair reserves the right to restrict the number of speakers. I wouldn't recommend that. But just so you know that, and I don't think there's any First Amendment issue by any stretch of the imagination. There certainly is not an Open Meetings Act issue, because the Open Meetings Act does not require you to listen to anyone. But as a matter of understanding what your public is concerned about, I think limiting them and telling people they're going to be limited, it works some places. I'm not sure that it would be ideal for the community that you serve.
So are you saying
Thank you.
the addition of the language, you're not recommending the addition of the language around diversity of viewpoints?
No, that's not what I'm saying.
Okay.
I'm saying that there are some LEAs or some of your sister school systems that indicate if there are a number of individuals speaking on the same topic, that the chair has the right to limit the number of speakers. So if everyone is speaking about the letter A, then the chair has the option to say, we're only going to accept X number of speakers about the letter A. The rest of you, we know you're talking about the letter A, and we don't need to hear from all of you.
Oh, okay.
Again, clearly it works somewhere.
So I understand that structure and it's appealing. However, I don't know that that's going to work for our system. And then again, I'm kind of flipping back and forth. Is there some way to put some language to that if we run over? So we have 20 spots total. And because again, it happens more so when there's a hot topic that we have a lot of people show up or a lot of people wanting to speak. So is there some language that we can add? And again, maybe this is more operational, I guess, than policy, but if more than 20 people want to speak, if we do have duplications, that we can restrict people speaking on a certain topic. And I say that more so that we have a breadth of topics and that more people are able to get their views across about the different topics they're concerned about, instead of it, again, just one topic and hearing 4 or 5 opinions on that same topic, but there were other people who wanted to speak.
So and I'm not saying you can't do it, because I'm happy to try to write whatever the committee's pleasure is. But with respect to, we're talking 5 spaces now, because my presumption is that for the community groups, you don't want the same restriction. So if all the community groups want to speak about X, that that's not the same restriction as on the individuals and your unions and your school system affiliated groups. So we're talking about 5 spaces, and I'm sorry, all of the 10 spaces, community groups as well as the individuals are going to be randomized. They're all going into a lottery. So you're still going to be selecting randomly and then determine whether or not that individual has spoken within or group has spoken within the last 30 days. So there's still a couple steps to get to before they're able to speak. Again, I'm happy to present some language for the committee's consideration, but
I also think it may be difficult to, I don't think define is the right word, but a specific topic, because we may have 2 speakers speaking about the same topic, but have completely different viewpoints on that topic. And we would want to hear both of those opinions, even if they're on opposite sides. So it may be difficult to narrow it down to say, we don't want to hear people speaking on the same topic, because you could have very different opinions on the same topic. I think it would be difficult to narrow that down. I think is what I'm
Agreed,
trying to.
and it wasn't to limit it from that perspective,
Yes.
hearing different points of view. Again, it was more the same point of view. That's all, but I agree with what you're saying, so that's fine. I was just kind of throwing some thoughts out there, as well as also the language about 30 calendar days. There are, what is it, like maybe during the summer, I believe the board may only meet once a month instead of twice. So maybe would it be better to have 2 board meetings, the prior 2 board meetings versus the 30 calendar days, just so we cover those instances where there's exceptions and there's only 1 board meeting per month.
That's a great idea. I like that idea. I wasn't even thinking about the fact that we have some months where we don't have 2 board meetings. So that would limit it if we didn't change that.
And you also have 1 board meeting in April, generally.
So that wouldn't complicate it for Tracy too much operationally. Yeah.
I will check with her, but her plan was to check the transcript and check the speakers who were chosen against the transcript, which is verbatim anyway.
Okay.
So the 2 prior board meetings, that was your desire, members of the committee?
Yes, I think that's a great idea.
Okay.
So are we, at this point, it sounds like we are all in agreement that option 1 is the best option?
Frimpong, yes.
Harvey, yes.
And Ms. Howie, are we, at this point, I'm looking back at my agenda here. Are we supposed to be moving this forward, or does this come back to us again? In other words, are we going to need to move to amend option 1 to change the language about the 30 days?
Yes.
Okay.
So, and if with the amendment, it is to the committee's satisfaction, it can certainly go forward to first reader. If, however, the committee wishes to see this again, staff can bring this back, the option 1 back with the language about the 2 prior board meetings. So it's the committee's pleasure.
So we can move to make the amendments of the two prior board meetings and move option 1 forward for first reader without having it to re-review it.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
And I
so
think,
moved, Harvey.
I think if we are in agreement, that option 1 is our choice and there aren't any other, that would be fine. So do we need to, Ms. Harvey wants to invite the motion. Do you want to put it in the chat, Ms. Harvey?
I think that Ms. Wash and I have it.
Okay, thank you.
Just to save you from, and Ms. Pitts is our backup as well. So I think we know what the committee wants. But just to make sure staff is clear, so that on page 2 of option 1, line 35, to strike within the last 30 calendar days and insert during either of the two prior board meetings. Is that the committee's pleasure?
Yes.
Yes.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you. So now we will make sure I have this correct. Since we have unanimous consent, we don't have to vote, correct? Okay,
Correct.
so we are going to,
So you have unanimous consent on the amendment. So now the question is about whether or not to send the policy forward as amended, just to make sure we follow both steps. And you do have a question.
Or point, I guess,
Oh,
point
sorry,
of
I didn't see that.
clarification. So
Yes.
that was one amendment, and then I believe the other amendment was that line 15, correct? As far as to which the superintendent has assigned a staff liaison.
You're correct.
oh,
Correct.
thank you. Thank you. So is everybody, are we all in agreement with that amendment as well, to remove the language regarding the superintendent? Trying to pull it back.
Yes.
Harvey, I'm in agreement.
Okay.
Frimpong, yes.
Dr. Sawyer, yes.
Okay, so we have unanimous consent for both amendments. So now the question is to move forward with first reader regarding policy 83 first 15 with both as amended. I'm not to say with both amendments, as amendment, as amended. Is there any discussion? Any discussion or questions? Okay,
This is Harvey. I move that we forward policy 8315 forward for first reader as amended.
Frimpong, second.
if everyone, if all of us are in agreement and no objections, policy 8315 will move forward to first reader as amended. Did I do that correctly, Ms. Howie?
Yes, you did.
I don't think we've had many motions, so that was sort of a first for me. Thank you. Okay, so next is item D, which is our 2023-2024 proposed meeting dates. And for this, Ms. Howie will present the calendar.
Yes, thank you, members of the committee. You have before you, as Exhibit D, as in David, proposed meeting dates for the 23-24 school year. You'll note that as per normal procedure, there's no meeting in January. That is because of the number of budget meetings that the committee has. We'd like you to live to get to February, so we don't want to overtax the committee. As well, there is no meeting in April as a result of only one scheduled board meeting, and that's usually the month that NSBA holds its annual meeting. And finally, the other adjustment that staff is recommending is that we have our June meeting on the 18th, which is a Tuesday, as opposed to that Monday, which is one of the Muslim holidays.
And I'm muted, I apologize. Thank you, Ms. Howie. Does anyone have any questions or comments regarding the proposed meeting dates? Okay, as there are no objections, the dates are adopted and will be posted to the board's website.
Thank you, members of the committee.
Thank you, Ms. Howie. The floor is now open to members of the committee to discuss issues of concern. I must emphasize that this is not the time to conduct business, as there has not been notice provided as required by the Open Meetings Act. Anyone have anything they would like to say? Okay, the next meeting of the Policy Review Committee is scheduled for Monday, June 26th at 4:30 p.m. Because there is no further business, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
you
Have a
very
good
much.
evening.
Thank you.
Thank
Good
you for
night.
your